Sometimes we want to repeat an action a number of times. For example, let's imagine we want to display hello world 5 times on the console. The poor way of doing that is like this. So console.log hello world and then repeat it 5 times. This code is ugly. There is a better way to achieve the same result, and that's where we use loops. In JavaScript, we have various kinds of loops, and all these loops essentially do the same thing. They repeat an action a number of times. We have for loops, while loops, do while loops, for in loops, and for of loops. All these loops essentially do the same thing. But there is a subtle difference between how they start and end. Let's start by looking at the for loop. So back to this code. This is how we write a for loop. So for, we add parentheses. Now here we need 3 statements. The first statement is what we call the initial expression. And here we declare and initialize a variable. So we use let to declare a variable like I and set it to 0. Now I is short for index and is a common convention to use in for loops. This is what we call the loop variable. So we initialize it to 0, then we terminate this statement with a semicolon. Now the second part of the for loop is what we call a condition. So here we want to add a condition and compare the value of I with something else. This loop will run as long as this condition evaluates to true. So if we want this loop to run 5 times, we compare I with 5. So as long as I is less than 5, this loop will execute. You will see that in a second. Once again, we terminate this statement with a semicolon. And finally, the third part. This is what we call increment expression. And quite often, what we have here is something like this. So we use the increment operator to increment the value of I with 1. Now, after this for statement, we can add 1 or more statements, just like the if statements. If we have multiple statements here, we need to put them in a code block like this. Now here, we want to display hello world on the console. So our statement is console.log hello world. So instead of repeating this line 5 times, we put it in a for loop, and this loop will run 5 times. Now save the changes. So we get 5 hello world messages on the console. All right, now that you have seen a for loop in action, let's see exactly how this loop works. So earlier I told you this is what we call an initial expression. Here we're initializing I to 0. Now this loop will execute as long as this condition is true. So as long as I is less than 5, the statements we have here will be executed. Now, after the first iteration, I is incremented by 1. Then this condition is evaluated again. So 1 is less than 5. So one more time, this loop is executed. So we have the second iteration. Now after the second iteration, once again, I is incremented by 1. So now we are in the third iteration. Again, this condition is evaluated, and because it is true, the loop is executed. To show you this in action, I'm gonna output I on the console. So save the changes. This is what we get. So note that in the first iteration, I is 0, then it's incremented by 1 until it reaches 4. So at the end of 5th iteration, I will be 4. And when we increment that by 1, it will be 5. So this condition will evaluate to false. So essentially, there are 2 ways to repeat an action a number of times using the for loop. Let's say we want to repeat something 5 times. We can initialize I to 0 and check to see if it's less than 5. Alternatively, we can initialize this to 1 and check to see if it's less than or equal to 5. Now, if we save the changes, you can see I starts from 1 and finishes at 5. Now, we can make this program a bit more interesting. Let's say we want to display the odd numbers between 1 to 5. So instead of logging hello world on the console, we can have an if statement and check the remainder of the division of I by 2. So if the remainder of division of I by 2 is not 0, that means I is an odd number. So we can display it on the console. Save the changes. So here are the odd numbers between 1 to 5. There is also another way to write this loop. Instead of starting from 1 and going all the way up to 5, we can start from 5 and go back to 1. So we change the initial expression, set I to 5. As long as I is greater than or equal to 1, now we want to decrement I. Save the changes. Now we get the odd numbers in the reverse order. Now it's more common to use the previous form, so we initialize I to 0 or 1 and increment it in every iteration. But in certain problems, you want to use a for loop in the reverse order.